What's up you guys, Mo Awesome from Awesome MTB and welcome to the Awesome MTB Ultimate XC Bike Shootout. What's going on you guys, Mo Awesome from Awesome MTB and welcome back to the Awesome MTB XC Shootout. Over the last few weeks we have been testing out 7 of the best XC bikes on the market and trying to figure out who each bike is for and what is the ultimate XC bike. In today's video we're going to be breaking down the Pivot Mach 4 SL. Now this has to be one of the most interesting bikes of the test because not only does it have one of the most unique suspension designs, the DW Link, which is a personal favorite of mine, but it also has a very different geometry. Now before we get into the review of the Pivot Mach 4 SL, I do want to give a huge thank you to Pro Bike Supply for partnering up with us for this buyer's guide. We knew going into this that we would want to partner up with a special bike shop, and Pro Bike Supply was the first shop that came to mind because they specialize in custom builds. They really do know how to make your dream build a reality. They have so many rad brands to choose from, and on top of that, they have expert mechanics assembling your bike, so you can rest assured knowing that when your bike arrives to you, it is ready to hit the trails. On top of that, once again, you guys, they have so many awesome brands to choose from, and they really do want to make sure your dream becomes a reality. So if you're ever in the market for your next bike, be sure to hit up Pro Bike Supply and let them know we sent you because they take care of friends of the channel. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Pivot Mach 4 SL. So this is a 115mm XC bike. However, it also has a bolt and a chip that will actually allow you to bring this bike down to 106mm of rear travel without affecting the geometry. Up front, we do have a 2025 Fox 34 step cast fork with 120mm of travel, and in the rear, we do have a Fox float rear shock. Now, there is no remote lockout on this bike. However, on the World Cup edition, which has a little bit less travel overall, it does feature a lockout. Now, this is a size extra large frame. I am 6'2", and I will say this was probably also one of the shortest bikes overall of the test. It actually has the shortest wheelbase, and the reach also was a little bit on the shorter side. However, I will say at 6'2", I did feel like this was a perfect fit. I do feel like those numbers are going to contribute to why I actually think this bike might be perfect for a lot of riders out there, especially if you live in techie terrain. For the drivetrain, we actually have Shimano XTR 12-speed drivetrain on there. However, we do have Raceface Next SL carbon cranks. Up front, we actually do have Pivot's own grips as well as carbon handlebars and stem, and we do have XTR 2-piston brakes on here. For the wheels, we actually have Reynolds carbon wheels laced to Industry 9 Hydra hubs. For tires, we actually have a Maxxis Recon up front and a Recon Race in the rear, and this actually honestly is probably going to be one of my favorite tire setups. For the dropper post, we actually have a Fox Transfer dropper post on here. Now for the frame itself, like I said, they use their tried and true DW Link suspension design, which is actually my personal favorite, but something to note is you do actually only have room for one water bottle in the frame. Like I said, you do have that 2-position travel adjust that doesn't affect the geometry. It just affects how much travel the bike has as well as how that travel acts out on the trails. In terms of weight, this is a very light build. It's actually coming in about 24.5 pounds, which is actually going to be in line with the Specialized S-Works Epic as well as the Yeti ASR. Now that's the Pivot Mach 4 SL that I've been testing over the last few weeks. Before we get into what I love about this bike and some things that I don't love about this bike, let's go for a ride really quick and show you guys how this thing performs out on the trails. What's up you guys? Welcome to another loop of our favorite loop. I'm so sick and tired of this loop, but in the name of science, I'm gonna do it a million times until we figure out what is the best short travel XC bike. And today we have the Pivot Mach 4 SL with the 120mm fork, 115mm of rear travel, and we're gonna put this thing through the paces so you guys can see how this thing performs on the trail. We are climbing without the shocks locked out because there's no remote lockout. It's a DW Link bike, one of the only DW Links in the test. And man, the anti-squat in Pivot bikes, probably some of the best. And I would say if there's any bike in this shootout that can get away without a remote lockout, it would probably be this one. Making our way up the climbs, like I said, you guys, Pivot DW Link bikes, I think are some of the best DW Link suspension bikes on the market. The traction is pretty insane, especially when it comes to technical climbing, but at the same time too, like I said, as soon as you get out of the saddle or just put the power down, really gas it, you definitely feel the pedaling platform stiffen up a bit, and it gives you this awesome acceleration feel almost as if the shock is locked out, but as soon as you kind of ease off just a little bit, when you want traction, that traction's back. Another thing to note as we make this little switchback climb, this bike has one of the shortest chainstays of the test. I don't think the shortest, but it's definitely short, as well as the shortest overall wheelbase, because the reach is actually shorter with the 120 mil fork. So yeah, just pointing that out. It definitely feels like a smaller XL, however, not too small to where I'm concerned sizing wise. Just a different feel from the bike overall. We have the seat angle test, steepest part of this little test loop, making its way up. This bike on paper, the seat angle does seem relatively slack. And when you first hop on it, it does feel slacker seat angle wise than other bikes in this category. However, with that being said, man, my attitude on seat angles, I feel like has been shifting. And I do feel like with these shorter travel bikes, it hasn't been the deal breaker that I thought it was. Everyone's favorite part of the test, downhills, and we are on 5 Oaks. This is definitely an interesting bike, I would say, and probably one of the most interesting of the test. Because on paper, like I said, it is such a short bike, and on the trail too, it does feel relatively short wheelbase wise. However, the traction, how well this thing is planted to the ground, combined with just how fun it is overall, like that, man, this thing is a blast to ride. And it's so light too. This bike does have a relatively higher stack height in comparison to some other bikes in the test. And with that being said, more technical style downhills, especially when it gets techie and steep, I feel like this bike definitely has a much more controlled nature and allows you to ride it like it has so much more travel and weighs so much more than it does. Whew. God, that rear end too is freaking so nimble with how tucked in it is. You guys know Pivot, they love short chainstays. This bike is no exception. And you can still treat it like a really fun trail bike, even though at its heart, it definitely possesses a much more XC feel to it. Okay, nice. Woo! Oh my God. At its nature, this bike has such a shreddy personality. That was the most cringy word, but that's what I'm gonna use to describe it. This bike really does wanna rip. And like I said, I think a lot of that's gonna be attributed to it having a little shorter overall wheelbase, as well as a slightly shorter chainstay as well. The Pivot Mach 4 SL, I personally think is a bike that stands out from the test because yes, it definitely goes up against the Epic, the Scalpel, the ASR, the Mondraker even. When it comes to weight, it's definitely one of the lighter bikes in the test. I think the DW link really is what makes this bike stand out. You could definitely tell the overall suspension profile so much more unique than the single pivot bikes. Pivot is a company that's based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Their backyard is South Mountain, and I feel like that's where you're gonna notice this bike definitely has a technical terrain nature to it. Slightly higher bottom bracket, like I said, slightly higher stack height, shorter stays, and a DW link suspension design that I think definitely rewards techie climbers. And I do think this might be one of the best technical climbing bikes of the test. This bike has such a freaking amazing acceleration when you really get on the gas. That anti-squat built into Pivot bikes. I keep reiterating that. Some of the best pedaling bikes I feel like are Pivots, especially when you're putting the hammer down. Another thing to consider with the Pivot Mach 4 SL is even though the frame looks a little on the, I would say, skinnier side coming into this rock garden, I will say the bike definitely feels very stiff. And if I had to say, I would say overall, one of the stiffer frames in the test, which blew me away because when I first unboxed this bike, I was somewhat skeptical, thinking, man, this bike looks so light, so skinny. And I was wondering how they were gonna achieve that stiffness. I'm blown away by the stiffness element of the frame. The bars too, the Pivot stock bars, are also somewhat stiff, but you can really feel it from the frame in that rock garden. This frame has such a stiff, precise feel to it. And you can tell Pivot wanted to optimize efficiency and then optimize fun on those corners with that chainstay length. God, this bike is such a blast to ride. Oh my God, I gotta be careful, guys. I am, I think, starting to get a little too cocky on short travel rigs, but it really does go to show you how far this travel category has come. Let's get back, finish the review of the Pivot Mach 4 SL. I want to start off with the things that I absolutely love about the Pivot Mach 4 SL. The first thing that I absolutely love is I feel like this is going to be a technical rider's dream bike. Once again, you guys, I've stressed this before, Pivot does have South Mountain as their backyard, and that is probably one of the most techiest places you can ride bikes. And I really do feel like they want to make sure that you have the confidence anytime you encounter technical terrain. Now, some things that are going to contribute to the confidence over technical terrain, the first thing is going to be that short rear end. This definitely had one of the shortest rear end of the bikes and overall shortest wheelbase. What that allows on the trails, especially when it gets tight, techy, and twisty, is you get a lot of maneuverability out of this bike, and the rear end is very maneuverable. I will say this probably has one of the most nimble rear end of bikes out of the entire shootout, excluding the Evil following, and I definitely always felt like I could put this bike exactly where I want it. The term precise definitely comes to mind, and I definitely think if you were to summarize this bike with one word, it's going to be precise. Now, another thing that I loved about this bike is the overall stack height up front was slightly taller than other bikes in this buyer's guide. You definitely feel like you had a little bit more control over your line choice, and I definitely felt more confident overall on steeper trails on this bike. And when you get on this bike, you definitely notice that you have a lot of control of the front end of the bike, and like I said, paired with that maneuverability of the rear end, you get a bike that you can put exactly where you want to when you want to. Another thing that I absolutely love about this bike is the DW Link suspension design. I definitely felt in terms of traction over tech, this bike had the most traction out of the test while also retaining its pedal efficiency. As soon as you get out of the saddle on this bike and really put the power down, that's where the pivot nature comes to life, and you can definitely feel the bike tightening up a little bit to give you that acceleration you want on sprint sections. And you can definitely tell that sacrificing a few grams going with the DW Link as opposed to going with something simpler like a single pivot definitely gives them the ability to have a much more, I would say, sophisticated suspension profile out on the trails. But like I said, this is also a very lightweight bike, and I would say that's actually another thing that I absolutely love about the Pivot Mach 4 SL. This thing feels like an XC bike, but at the same time, it has a lot of stiffness from the frame. You can definitely tell when you're on this bike that Pivot really wants to go for that XC weight, and you definitely feel inspired to put long days in the saddle when you are riding this bike. Now, let's talk about some things that I don't necessarily love about the Pivot Mach 4 SL that might be a deal breaker for some riders out there. In this buyer's guide, this is definitely one of the shorter bikes overall, and for riders that might want a little bit more high-speed stability, I would actually say that's probably one of the downsides of the Mach 4 SL in comparison to some other bikes in this buyer's guide. The high-speed stability is noticeably less than the other bikes in this category. Now, once again, you guys, this thing still is plenty capable, especially on technical downhills, but when the pace gets fast, especially on straight line trails like out here in Laguna, definitely feel you might want a little bit of a longer reach up front or maybe a little bit of a longer chainstay. However, I do feel like that would take away from what makes this bike truly unique. Another thing I do want to point out is out of the bikes in this buyer's guide, I did feel like the seat angle on this thing was probably at the max limit in terms of slackness. It is right around 74.7 degrees, I believe. However, I did feel like in comparison to some other bikes in this buyer's guide, it did feel a little on the slacker side, especially on very steep climbs. Now, I will say it was only apparent on those steep style climbs, and I actually do think that going with a seat angle like this, Pivot bikes definitely put you in a little bit more of an explosive stance, especially when technical climbs come up. And I feel like a lot of that's going to be where you're seated and where the positioning of yourself is on this bike on climbs. So yeah, I feel like what you do feel on steeper climbs, that seat angle maybe being a little on the slacker side, is actually a pro on technical style climbs. I will also say if you're not 6'2", and I actually have a ridiculous saddle height, so seat angles definitely affect me more so than it would affect you. Now, something that I'm not entirely sure yet if it's going to be something I love about this bike or I don't love, maybe I'm just going to need some more time on it, is going to be the new 2025 Fox suspension. So once again, you guys, this has a Fox 34 step cast up front and a Fox float rear shock. We'll touch on this a little bit more in the conclusion video of the series. However, I definitely feel like Fox suspension on the cross-country bike platforms gives the bikes a little bit more of a racy style feel, where I feel like RockShox suspension definitely has a little bit more of a muted element and maybe take a little bit of the harshness out on the trails. Fox suspension, I feel like, is a little bit stiffer in that initial stroke. However, it also also gives you this very hit a bump and kind of generate speed forward that I feel like you would appreciate, especially in a timed XC environment. So to summarize things up, this is definitely one of the most nimble as well as technical capable XC bikes in this buyer's guide. Is it the right bike for you? I think if you're a rider out there that definitely has a lot of tech in your backyards, or maybe you have a lot of Arizona races or just Southern Utah races, I can definitely see you going with this bike. Is this my favorite bike in the buyer's guide? Because it does have my favorite suspension design. You guys will once again have to stay tuned for the awesome MTB XC buyer's guide conclusion videos, which like I said, it will be coming out soon. However, if you have any questions at all about the Pivot Mach 4 SL, let me know in the comment section. I really did love this bike. I think a lot of people are gonna like this bike. Is it the best bike? Stay tuned for more. Hopefully you enjoyed this review, and until next time, you guys, ride awesome. Subscribe to not miss out on the conclusion video of our series.